Well, yeah, thanks for inviting me, y'all. I've been meaning to get out and see y'all for a little bit, so it's nice to be here, particularly in times like these. So I'm going to start in talking about the 11 days that preceded the ceasefire that was declared almost 2 weeks ago tomorrow. Israel, with one of the most advanced militaries in the world, rained death upon one of the most densely populated regions in the world, one that's been under near complete blockade since 2007 and doesn't even have an army in the conventional sense. 248 people were murdered, 66 children, and 1,300 housing units severely damaged. 68 schools or healthcare facilities were bombed, including Gaza's only COVID testing lab. So with the ceasefire that happened, the exceptional violence of the Zionist entity in the form of the full-scale bombing has subsided, and people rightly breathed a sigh of relief. But in its stead is the return to the very unexceptional day-to-day violence of forcible expulsion, ethnic cleansing, occupation, and the lives of millions of refugees unable to return home. Israeli apartheid has not ceased. Gaza is still without power 18 hours of the day. Israeli and Palestinian police have rounded up for arrest dozens of youth activists, and a massive 350 building illegal Zionist settlement. It began construction in the West Bank. U.S. support also, of course, is intact. Yesterday, Israel announced that they are going to ask the U.S. for $1 billion more in aid to replenish the bombs and missiles used to level Gaza and murder children. So while those conditions are largely unchanged, there are some important things that I think also were very different about the events that occurred a couple weeks ago. It, to me, was remarkable that in the weekend after the ceasefire, there were massive demonstrations in solidarity with Palestine all throughout the US and the UK, like 100,000 people in London, the Middle East, Colombia, and elsewhere. As someone who's been doing Palestine solidarity work for a while, this is completely different. Usually when the bombs stop dropping, the demonstrations go home. Additionally, the slogans and the politics have shifted dramatically left, and the language of apartheid and racism and settler colonialism being affixed to Israel are more and more commonplace. This is why we should completely reject calls from people like Bernie Sanders, who, from a left position, argue the left needs to tone down its language. The Palestinian resistance in Palestine and in the diaspora should present the opposite lesson. Push harder, be steadfast in your resistance, and militant in your resolve. Israel's racist, Zionist, apartheid, say it loudly. So what has driven that change that I've described, this new thing, is the power of Palestinian resistance. Sadly, the catastrophe in Gaza eclipsed some of this stuff that was going on in Palestine that has driven this elemental change in the area and has kicked up waves internationally. The continued resistance of Palestinians under threat of forcible expulsion in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah began to pick up steam for weeks, and more international attention by youth directly confronting Zionist police and settlers. During that time, solidarity demonstrations at the nearby Al-Aqsa Mosque complex had to contest with the Zionist police to gain access to the sacred site and stand their ground to resist police raid and settler attacks. This provoked a massive uprising, not just in the West Bank and Gaza, but in the areas of Palestine that were seized by the Zionist entity in 1948. Over 20 cities behind this so-called Green Line rose up in rebellion, and in several cities, Palestinians took control, raised the Palestinian flag, and it took the IDF, settler militias that went through the streets armed, chanting death to Arabs, and a state of emergency to be able to regain control on behalf of Israel. Then, of course, about a week and a half ago, or maybe just a week, time moves fast, there was a coordinated general strike of Palestinians, both in the West Bank and behind the Green Line, that showed a unity of Palestinian resistance and the use of the strike weapon for the first time since the first intifada of the late 1980s. This uprising overall was very youth-driven and largely not just independent of, but in opposition to the traditional parties. And so I know that some of these facts I'm talking about, like y'all know some of that, but I think it's important to highlight because they demonstrate important features that we as socialists should hold on to and champion. And that's that the vibrancy of the struggle from below and how this situation reflects the need to see liberation for Palestine as requiring a deep systemic change in power structures in the region and the need for a class analysis. And so with that, I want to focus the rest of this talk on kind of what we call in the book the socialist perspective for Palestine to hopefully spark some conversation. This perspective, as I see it, that we argue in the book, has kind of two interlocking components. The first is that achieving a just solution to the situation in Palestine will require a challenge to capitalism regionally and perhaps beyond. The second component is that building a movement for socialism in the Western capitalist countries, like ours, will similarly require the cause of Palestine and anti-imperialism to be central to our movement. These two components are connected up by the international nature, of course, of the capitalist project and the international ruling class's desire for dominance, for profit, influence, etc. So I'm going to take on these two elements in turn. First, in talking about the importance of the social analysis in the region, I want to briefly describe Zionism and why it is essentially connected to imperialism. Zionism is a modern political ideology that calls for Jewish people internationally to live in a Jewish-only ethno-state. It began to be organized as a movement beyond small religious sects in the 1890s. And it should be noted that this is an ideology of intense pessimism, as it believes that anti-Semitism actually cannot be defeated in the countries of the world, and the only solution is a separate state. That's a pessimist approach. And that approach means that this was the minority position of the Jewish left internationally well up until World War II. The acquisition of this Jewish-only state required for its existence to be built on the colonization of other people, the Palestinians, and therefore the obliteration of their people, their culture, and their land. We use the term settler colonial because, unlike other forms of colonialism, in which a foreign power usually just seeks to express economic and political dominance over a native population, a settler colonial project seeks to displace and replace the native population. And this has been an explicit project of the Zionist movement in Palestine even before the declaration of the Israeli state. The project became carried out through the events of the Nakba, which, as folks know, is Arabic for catastrophe, in which Zionist militia carried out an organized plan of ethnic cleansing in which whole villages of Palestinians were driven from their homes, land stolen, and in many instances massacred, like in the villages of Deir Yassin and Tantura. Between 1947 and 1948, 1 million Palestinians were driven from this land. And this process of ethnic cleansing, this violent practice that's carrying out the replacement of peoples, has continued since that day. It was through this action that Israel declared itself a state. Like, its declaration of being a state was ethnic cleansing. So it's important to note that even though they declared themselves a state, they haven't actually set their boundaries. They haven't set their borders. So it's a strange sort of entity in that regard. So the process of settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing has continued throughout this day. The Nakba is not a historic event in the past, but it's a historical process that is still threatening Palestinians. This can be seen in the fact that the construction of illegal settlements in the West Bank continue, and in the recent events in East Jerusalem neighborhoods of Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, where people are resisting being forcibly displaced from their homes. And this resistance, of course, sparked the events that I described from last month. And on top of that, the complete annexation of the West Bank is still very much on the agenda. Netanyahu is for it. The other opposition party who might oust him is also for it. And so this is something that's very much on the table. So this project of building a Zionist state, of course, wasn't carried out by a state, but by a movement, Zionists, that required backing from an imperial power to carry it out. And that is why Zionism, at every moment in its history, allied itself with imperial powers. Even if the principal backer has shifted. First it was, he was flirting with the Turkish and the Russians and the German Kaiser. Then with the institution of the state, it was the British. And now, of course, the special relationship that Israel has had with the US since the late 60s. The essence of the state as a Zionist ethno-state means it's also essentially a project of imperialism. It couldn't have happened any other way. So why is the US so invested then in this project? The Middle East is immensely strategically important for US capital. Oil is, of course, the favorite fuel of capitalism and makes everything go. And the majority of the oil comes from the region. And it's important to note that the US desire to make sure we got control over the oil isn't just for US consumption. The US is actually one of the larger creators of oil in the world as well, but just for control. The factories of China all run off of oil. And so the ability to control the flow of oil is an important one. Its geo-position is incredibly important. It's a shipping hub in the entire world. The Suez Canal, a large majority of shipping goes through there. Multiple ports flood all these goods that are so important for capital. And of course, the oil in and out of the region is so important. On top of that, the Middle East has become a new source for finance capital. So all the oil money in the Gulf states and the GCC have created a whole new sort of layer of private equity firms and different sort of financial organs that are investing all over the world. In 2016, for example, a Saudi-Japanese joint venture created the largest private equity firm that was ever created at the time of $100 billion. And so there's all this sort of finance, oil, geopolitics, shipping that make it an incredibly important region for capital. So how to secure US dominance and hegemony? The answer is to secure a powerful and solid ally / agent in the region, and that's Israel. So Israel, for most of its existence, has been the military outpost for the United States. The US's mighty aircraft carrier, as Netanyahu himself called it in 2017. Direct military funding to Israel makes up 59% of all the foreign military funding spent by the US, 3.8 billion per year as of the 2021 budget. And Israel's defense budget, which spends a greater percentage of its GDP than most countries in the world, has 20% of its total budget paid by this US foreign military funding. Additionally, the US and Israel signed a memorandum of understanding in which the US agreed to this amount over the next 10 years. So they're planning to pay it forward, so to speak. On top of this, there's the other arms sales, like the $725 million sale announced by the Biden administration on May 5th, which was just days before the bombs began to fall in Gaza. So this military creation of Israel as the watchdog state for US interests is the cornerstone of US dominance in the region. This huge amount of money that they spend is still cheaper for the US state than to maintain its own permanent bases. It also allows for a degree of plausible deniability in that Israel can kind of act as the mad dog and do things that in US interest that US may not want to do, like bomb a Syrian nuclear plant in 2017, carry out cyber attacks on Iranian nuclear sites, and during the 70s and 80s, basically funnel arms to nearly every military dictatorship and death squad in Latin America. It does this with a degree of massive stability because the US doesn't just, try to make an ally with Israel. They want to make an ally with whoever they can. The Saudis they run deep with, Egypt the same. But unlike the Arab states, in Israel, there has been very little internal unrest or challenge to the state or government because of the manner in which the Israeli working class is bought off on and invested in the Zionist project, thus invested in imperial sponsorship. The working class is invested in imperial sponsorship. So ensuring this stability and dominance of Israel in the region has meant the sacrifice of Palestinians to the gods of imperialism. This core feature has meant that challenging imperialism is essential for the Palestinian cause. However, this connection between imperialism and Zionism and the Palestinians being sort of kicked off their land actually has deepened in the past couple of decades. It's important to talk about that process. After the end of the Cold War, the US began the process of the implementation of a strategy to draw the entire region into a single economic zone characterized by free trade and investment flows, all under the thumb of US economic power. The question of Palestine was a fly in the ointment of this project, as hostility towards Israel, being sort of the vanguard of foreign colonialism and dominance, made the cause of Palestine one that was tremendously popular among the Arab masses, the working class, the so-called Arab street. So implementing some kind of peace process was necessary to give cover for the despots of the Arab states to be able to kind of come to the table, so to speak. But this peace process, of course, was purely a white rag of surrender forced into the mouths of Palestinians. This peace process was only the first step of a decades-long move to integrate the markets and circuits of capital in the region between Israel and the Arab states. And so don't just take my word for it. 1 year after Oslo, there was this big joint economic summit that happens all over the time, all over the world, where Bill Clinton, Secretary of State, proclaimed that because of Oslo, now the Middle East is open for business. That's his quote. And so this bipartisan strategy has been that of successive presidents since Clinton brokered Oslo, that Donald Trump rapidly accelerated this process of normalization with the normalization efforts that came to be known as the Bahrain Conference, his so-called deal of the century, and what some call the Abraham Accords. So this process means that there's been dramatic steps in the normalization of diplomatic and economic relations between Israel and the states of the region. And that means that Israel is integrated into the region through trade deals, security cooperation, transport, airplanes, proposed high-speed trains, the goal of which, to quote Tony Blair's Middle East Institute for Global Change, is to truly tap the economic potential of these markets. This process of normalization with settler colonial Israel strengthens the investment of the US and regional powers in maintaining the Israeli state. Normalization looks everything from the symbolic. So, the Israeli team plays in sport events in a regional basis, even though the Palestinian soccer team is refused travel visits, to the $28 billion in trade done between the Gulf Cooperation Council and Israel, to the existence of what's called QIZs, or qualified industrial zones. So these are areas that are similar to the Melquiadores on the Mexican border, which are allowed duty-free access to American markets. But in order for neighboring countries like Egypt or Jordan to get these, a certain percentage of the inputs, the sort of raw materials that come into the factories, have to come from Israel. So again, they're tying the bonds between the different economies in the region. And the normalization advance in the past couple of years, literally paid off with trade and arm deals, had meant that in the last year of Trump, we saw the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco all have normalized relationships with Israel, and more will follow. One of the consequences of this is that during the last bombing of Gaza, in which the UAE and a number of the normalized states did not mention a single word of condemnation of the bombs over Gaza. Not only that, but while this was happening, the UAE signed a $238 billion oil deal with Israel. And now statements from the Arab regimes have always been lip service for the Palestinians, but I think about what does it say if they'll not even express condemnation of what's going on. And that tells you the continued political isolation, unfortunately, of the Palestinian liberation movement on the level of states. Now, I think we could have a whole talk on normalization and its impact, but I think I want to sort of lay this out because I think it gives a sense of the situation that is facing the path to a just solution in Palestine. And the situation is this: with the global importance of the region that I talked about, Israel being integrated politically and economically into regional trade and capital flow only deepens the connection that's already established by its military role, backed up by billions of dollars every year from the US, and directly invests regional states and capital in the maintenance and support of the stability of Israel. And the stability of Israel, of course, means the continued erasure of Palestinians and the furtherance of the settler colonial project that is daily carrying out ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and maintains a stranglehold over Gaza, and every couple of years decides to just bomb Gaza to smithereens. If Zionism depends upon an imperial backer, the normalization embeds its security in the ruling class interests of capitalism, marries the interests of the US, Israel, and the Arab regimes formally in profit. Another consequence to the role of the Oslo Accords is that it established the Palestinian Authority, which is now managing the occupation in the West Bank and has integrated a burgeoning Palestinian capitalist class into these regional economic relationships. So they're in economic relationships with their occupiers and oppressors in the Israeli state. The result of this has meant that the living standards in the West Bank, not even to mention the human rights disaster of Gaza, continues to drop, even though there now exists, as a result of this peace process, a Palestinian capitalist class, small, wedded to the PA, that has developed through subcontracting the occupation and having a privileged trade relationship with the occupier. The main groups in the national liberation movement are stuck managing the conditions of occupation and have been defanged through an NGOization of resistance. And the current uprising in Palestine that just recently started is in many ways against this status quo of atrophied lack of resistance from the PA and Fatah. The people led themselves. So this deepening investment of regional states and global capital in the Israeli state means that challenges to that state will face stiff resistance. This is important because a just solution in Palestine, which would be the right of return to refugees, equal rights of people in the states, and an end to the occupation, is a challenge to the state of Israel because it means to challenge its very nature as a Jewish-only ethno-state. Having a democratic Palestine with equal rights for all would mean the destruction of the Israeli state as it currently exists, and that is something we should celebrate and strive for. Achieving that means having a movement and a politics that can challenge the situation of capitalism that backs up undemocratic regimes from Riyadh to Damascus to Tel Aviv to Washington and uses them to further advance their profits globally. And so this is not an abstract position. The events of the Arab Spring in 2011 and its kind of second wave just a couple years ago kind of gives a glimpse of what that would look like, what it would mean to have regional revolt as being an answer. In 2011, 4 long-running dictators were deposed. A few others came close, and the question of Palestine was very much on the agenda. Alongside of the Syrian and Egyptian flags in all the capitals was the flags of Palestine. In Egypt, the Israeli embassy was taken over. All the secret documents were thrown out. The ambassador had to flee, and briefly, just briefly for a few moments, the Rafah border crossing was opened up. And opening up the Rafah border crossing, which is where Egypt goes into Gaza, would completely change the situation in Gaza. And this excitement, this uprising of people around the region also gave spirit and confidence to the Palestinian resistance. On Nakba Day in 2011, thousands of Palestinians marched to the borders to exert their right of return from below. And I think it's notable that 3 weeks ago, when the uprising inflamed Palestine, we saw that again on a smaller scale, in which refugees in Jordan and in Lebanon both marched to the border to cross back into the land that they were forced away from many years ago. And so this is a uniquely perspective, that sort of this change comes from below, that we soon had these regional revolts, because it speaks better, I think, to the question of power and in whose interests international institutions serve, better than the liberal model, which relies exclusively on human rights. So what do I mean by that? So I think the focus on the human rights lens to fight for justice in Palestine has great utility. Exposing the atrocious everyday violence that Israel imposes upon the Palestinians and centering their voices of both trauma and heroic resistance is how we have and how we are going to be able to attract people to the cause of Palestine. They see the brutality and people want to take action. That's a good thing. We want to win them to support and take part in the struggle. This is essentially important. At the same time, I think by outlining this deep interconnection that capitalism regionally is invested in Israeli settler colonialism, hopefully one sees that capitalism is not going to be convinced by moral arguments about human rights to give up its support of Israel. Profits to these zombies far outweigh concerns over human rights, and that raises the stakes as to what kind of path to achieving a just solution might look like. This is the limits of a human rights only framework. We cannot expect the billions of dollars of profit to come in from regional circuits of capital and investment that is tied intimately with Israel, that have been tightening even more so, to be let go without dealing with the bigger questions of power and democracy that a socialist analysis brings to the table. And that's why a socialist perspective on the situation is essential. The very nature of Israel is inseparable from that of imperialism and settler colonialism. Therefore, its existence, as is currently construed as an ethno-state, is inherently incompatible with justice. Israel will not be coerced or convinced to conclude its own project. This scales similarly regionally and internationally, such that Israel's settler colonialism is interconnected with the projects of capitalism. The depth of this connection cannot be reformed away, which means the removal of these ties will require a character of rupture, of revolution. And so I want to sort of give an example of how this is theorized in a document from the Palestinian left that I think describes this very well, as far as what it means to kind of raise the horizon of what is required and what is possible. From a comrade on the Palestinian left in 1969, he said, "If we remember the enemy camp and recall its size and nature, we will immediately realize that any strategic thinking about the Palestinian liberation struggle must cover the mobilization of all forces of the revolution on the Arab and world levels. Because only through such mobilizations and concentration that we can create the power capable of confronting Israel, Zionism, world imperialism, and Arab reaction. The Palestinian Revolution, which is fused together with the Arab Revolution in an alliance with the World Revolution, is alone capable of achieving justice. To convince the Palestinian Revolution within the limits of the Palestinian people would mean failure if we remember the nature of the enemy alliance which we are facing. And that's why the cause of Palestine has been, from its inception, so internationalist, because it understands that scope. And I think we saw that with the demonstrations around the world, in which all over the world, these demonstrations for Palestine, in a sense, were the largest global manifestations against imperialism since the Gulf War. And so thinking about strategic sort of entry points is really important. And so it's important that as socialists in the West, of course, we don't just cheerlead and comment on resistance movements abroad, but actively work to build support and take up the struggle against the enemy at home. And that is the second point about the importance of building a movement, especially here in the United States, which is, of course, the primary international backer of Israel, and the capital, if you will, of international capitalism. How much time I got left?
You're currently at 25, Brian.
Perfect. Okay.
Sorry, I let the 20 roll by because you're finding your pace.
Totally. So when we talk about building a movement here, I think we can't separate out the question of imperialism and militarism when we talk about the question of economic equality. And so I want to sort of start there because I think it's something that is often done in socialist circles. People want to talk about Medicare for all, which is important, and the Green New Deal, which is important, but questions of imperialism and this massive amount of money that goes to funding death and destruction isn't talked about. And so if we sort of raise the horizon, trying to sort of figure on anti-imperialism having a more central role in the socialist movement, then Palestine figures in. Like as soon as you get into talking about US imperialism, Palestine emerges as US support for Israel is, of course, one of the sharpest edges of the imperial saber. That's why Israel and Palestine was the third rail of American politics for so long. If you start to talk about cutting the US military budget in favor of funding other things, then you're going to run into this unflagging US support for Israel that has continued for decades. You're going to have to campaign against all the propaganda used to justify a settler colonial ethno state, from claims to being the only democracy in the Middle East that needs to defend itself, to discussions of US security, and of course the ubiquitous claim that to criticize Israel is anti-Semitic. I think luckily some of these ideas have shifted to the left. And I think that, again, the lesson from this is that the shifting to the left came from resistance from below, came from an antagonism with the powers that be, and came from raising the stakes away from the idea that we need to negotiate a peace process, but to talk about the problem being Zionism. It's not about Netanyahu being the prime minister of Israel, but it's about the Israeli state. Some of these sort of things have been raised purely by sort of building this movement from below. And that's a really essential point for us here when we talk about indicating who our enemy is as well. I think additionally, socialists should always be on the side of the oppressed. If we operate on the basis that we want the self-emancipation of the entire working class, and not just domestically, which I think what some people talk about, but internationally, we have to be the stalwart champions of struggles against oppression. That's how we achieve the unity of our class that's required to win socialism, and that's done not just through words, but through deeds. That means that socialists should fight around Palestine as the government of the state that we inhabit, who we paid tax dollars to, who ostensibly we're supposed to elect, is the chief backer, supporter, and sponsor to one of the most racist states in the world, and one that is currently carrying out ethnic cleansing every day, with every new settlement that's established as it maintains the open-air prison of Gaza. That means that socialists in the countries of the West should be on the forefront of struggling against the Palestinian movement. And so I'm going to close with one last, I think, image that I really grabbed onto from the movement in Palestine a little while ago. And that is that the day before the bombs began dropping in Gaza, there were a number of Palestinians who had gathered in a solidarity protest with Sheikh Jarrah, who had been going back and forth with the Zionist police, trying to get into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is, of course, a very holy site for Islam, and it was Ramadan, so getting in there was very important. For days, they tried to sort of push past the cops fought back against them, and they made it into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then the day that they made it in was also a so-called holiday in Israel called Jerusalem Day, in which they celebrate the conquering of Jerusalem from the Palestinians in 1967. And so there was a armed mob of settlers who were going to celebrate this by marching basically into the mosque. And so on this day, the Palestinians held the ground against Zionist police, against these settlers, to defend the ethnic cleansing of Sheikh Jarrah, and they made a mural on the ground in front of the Al-Aqsa Mosque out of shell casings and rubber bullets and all the detritus that the Zionist police had sort of thrown their way. And the mural said in Arabic, "No passaran." They shall not pass, which of course comes from the slogan from the Spanish Revolution, in which the anarchists and the communists, the socialists, were defending Madrid against a fascist coup. And so this same kind of internationalism, I think, that is embedded in the Palestinian struggle is, I think, something that we should follow as we think to kind of raise the stakes of the game here, as they have done as well. And so I'll conclude there, and I'm sure there's lots of questions, but hopefully that helps spark a few conversations.